Brian Grazer read this script called Backdraft. And it was a script that was available that we hadn't developed internally, but it was really unlike anything that we had ever read. It's about firemen and the heroism of the fire department and the danger involved. And it just seemed like such an obvious movie that should be made. These guys are the purest form of the American hero. These guys, they're not like cops or sheriff or military guys that go out to save you and to help you, but they also have authority and they have guns. And that offsets a little bit of the danger. Whereas firemen, they have one pure goal, and that is to get out there and to save lives. And many times it can be at the expense of their own life.
I'm going! You go, we go!
Well, I was a fireman. I paid for film school by working for the fire department in Southern California, and so I always wanted to try and come up with a story that I thought could use some of the experiences and some of the stories I had from that work.
Greg had this idea. He'd been at fire department Laguna Beach, and somebody had been propelled across the Pacific Coast Highway, 4 lanes, and through the front windshield of a car, which is what we did in the movie, and that's where the idea started.
Actually, I think I was still at UCLA when I wrote a very, very early draft of what eventually became Backdraft, kind of centering it around events in a firehouse and an arson investigation story.
Thanks for coming to my graduation today, brother. Real inspiration.
And at the core of it was always this idea of 2 brothers whose father had died. He was a fireman, and the one is the rookie fireman, and his older brother is the experienced fireman.
I always wanted to do a movie about brothers, and that sibling relationship, the power of that, the conflicts that come out of it.
Roll the hose now! I'm not gonna quit, Steven, you hear me?
I'd witnessed a backdraft happen when I was a fireman, and they're very chilling and creepy things, you know, because they don't give any evidence that they're about to blow.
A backdraft is a situation that occurs when a room is hot and it has burned away all the oxygen. So nothing's on fire because it can't burn without oxygen. So it's just this heat and sometimes some smoke waiting, and it creates this vacuum. And if a firefighter goes along and breaks a window or kicks the door open, there's a sudden rush of air, of oxygen into that fire and almost instantaneous combustion. It's every firefighter's worst nightmare.
The story is about these guys who are essentially going out and slaying a dragon every day, that it was a very natural leap, I think, to personalizing the fire. And it was definitely written that way. I mean, the fire is written in the script as if it's angry, or it's upset, or it's sneaky, or it's this, or it's that.
It could stalk you, it could suffocate you, it could chase you into another room.
It's in the walls!
It had a personality much like the shark in Jaws.
Ron Howard called me and said, you've got this great script called Backdraft. And I said, it's right, Ron, it's really good. He said, well, I'd like to direct it. And I just about dropped the phone at that point. So it was quite exciting, and then it got put together pretty quickly.
The choice of Chicago as a location for this film, it was Greg's idea from the beginning, and he knew Chicago quite well, and he'd interviewed firemen in Chicago and really liked the tough guy, sort of macho quality of firemen in Chicago.
We really tried to take advantage of the city of Chicago. The funeral march was one example where we had, I think, 9 cameras going, because that was a one-time deal. You can't really back up a procession like this. You better get it or not. And we were so lucky because we really did want it to look pretty, and that day it started to rain, and that was wonderful. That's really what we wanted for this funeral. And that's where the city also came to our rescue, because these are not extras, they're real firemen in that procession. So I think everybody felt that was really important.
The talk with Ron, to begin with, at the very beginning, was mostly that we're going to do it in Chicago on location. We'll have to go out and find the places to do it in. So designing basically became a minimal thing. You're going to work within the spaces that you find. So the biggest problem we had was, what do you do with take two after you've burned the set? Because this is real fire. You had to do take 2, 3, 4, whatever was needed. So it was all designed by effects to just turn the valves and it all went out.
Fire out!
And I had to just make it with fire retardant paint or chemicals that go over it to slow the fire down. But most of the stuff didn't really burn. And the one set that we did do, which looked like it was burned at the very beginning of the film, where he goes back to inspect it to see what was there, we put phony walls inside the building, which we had previously burned, and set against the walls in the building. So it looked like when you walked through it with all the debris and everything, it was burned. But when we were through shooting in it, we just took everything out of it and it was back into its condition as when we first went into it. We went into several places. One of them was an empty warehouse, several stories high. And in there, we set up everything we had to, including the explosions to blow the windows out and everything else like that. And most of our stuff was done there. Then we had the warehouse on what they called Chicago City Studios, which actually was a vacant factory where kitchen appliances were made. That was where we built some other sets. That's where we had a set burned down, as a matter of fact. When you read the script, or when I read the script, I say, oh my God, how are we going to do this? This is impossible. You can't do this. But then you realize, in fact, there is no such thing as a moving picture. It's one still shot next to another still shot next to another still shot. And when you break them down, you can do it, because it brings you down to just what the camera is going to see.
Well, that's okay. I'm going to do a shot for this anyway. Cut it open a little bit.
The primary thing that I remember Ron talking about was the reality of firefighters and how to make it as real as possible. Now, this was fraught with peril because the costumes weigh about 85 or 90 pounds, and it was over 100 degrees. Ron approaches things from a very realistic, grounded point of view. So that's the way I approach the costumes.
The actors were sort of back and forth on it because there was, at that point, no film had been done about firefighters in years and years and years. And there was a kind of a question of, do we look cool or, do we look a little geeky in these coats, these heavy coats and these kind of flat-brimmed helmets? And ultimately, I just said, firefighters in general, Chicago firefighters in particular, they're cool because we say they're cool. And you guys are cool because you're great actors.
We had a connection with the place that actually supplies all the city uniforms in Chicago. I talked to a lot of firemen, and if you'll notice in Backdraft, a lot of the fire coats are personalized. Everybody has a nickname, like Kurt Russell's character, his name was Bull. And we wrote it on the back, and there were all these little symbols, and everyone had to be personalized and aged down. But we used the real thing. A lot of actors, the costuming is the first layer of finding out who their character is.
Was that before or after you noticed you were standing in a lake of gasoline, you idiot?
Working with De Niro was a much more complex understanding to help him find the character. It was very important to him where the costumes were bought and how they were cleaned. I mean, and he was involved in that whole process of how does he take care of his clothes? He lives alone. I mean, he was very involved in how the clothes were wrinkled, and it was really interesting how he approaches the clothes.
Hey. Hey, Jen. I see Grandma's still a bit...
Yeah, she still hates you.
Well, Jennifer came from, the neighborhood. And this was a girl that was, of all the characters, I would say she was the most stylish. because she was attempting to move up in the political world. She had ambitions and goals for herself. But if you look at her clothes, they were very classic, professional clothes.
You guys should just try picking up the phone once in a while, you know?
And Rebecca was a wife of a fireman living in a neighborhood with a son.
I didn't know you'd be up so early.
So the only time we sort of took a little bit of liberty is at the dance. And we just sort of wanted to give her a little bit of awareness of her sexuality, because it had to do with the dramatic tension of the moment.
You gotta change the view.
Give it a yank, give it a good pull. This intersection, see, you gotta get these cars out of your way.
I had the pleasure of working with arguably the most prolific composer alive, is Hans Zimmer.
I did a film called Black Rain with Ridley Scott, and there was a rumor that Ron was doing Backdraft, and somebody had put together a videotape of just fire footage, and he put one piece of Black Rain underneath it. And Ron went, hang on a second, this makes the fires emotional. Now, I know what to do with those fires now, make hands to it. No, something like that. But I think that's really how I got the job, because I was very young in Hollywood in those days.
And so during the production, he was writing music and playing it for Ron and myself and other folks.
I got to write something overtly heroic and overtly American, which I never did before, never done since. Because the great thing about firemen is you can truly root for them. I mean, there's no ambiguous feelings you can have about their heroism. So I just sort of loved the idea that I could all out just go heroic. But I remember having this idea that there would be two themes which wouldn't come together until the very end. And literally, sort of the last piece you hear when they're driving in that big, revealing shot of Chicago, that's the only time you hear the two themes together as proper counterpoint. I don't think anybody ever recognized it. Nobody ever got the idea, but I just remember sitting there forever and working out how to have two autonomous themes that could actually go and completely support each other. Because that was the idea, it's about the individual and, supporting each other as a group. I was writing all this stuff and Ron kept saying, it's not emotional. And I kept thinking, what does he mean, emotional? Love theme? Like, I don't, and suddenly I remembered this Black Rain thing and the impact it had. Oh, that's, okay, of course, that was emotional. I think Ron breathed a huge sigh of relief. He didn't have to fire me. Backdraft became, the sum total of everything I knew up to that point in my life.
What's been most satisfying in a way about the movie is how much firemen have responded to it. I think they found a lot of pride in it. I think it boosted the morale of firemen, hopefully around the world, certainly in the United States.
I traveled with the picture around the world. We had parades with firemen, and I had more people come up to me in tears because they had a family member who was a firefighter who was killed. It was incredibly moving, and they were talking about the power of family. And if you look at the fire departments in general, all over the world, it's fathers and sons and grandfathers and cousins, and there's a whole lineage that goes on.
Yeah, well, recent events and 9/11 in particular, I think has again raised the profile of police and firemen around the country, and hopefully I think the film succeeds in putting the audience into the firemen's world.
I've met more people who became firefighters because of this movie. They saw this movie and they said, I want to be a hero. This is what I want to do. And that's the thing I'm probably most proud of.
Through Catastrophe, through other films, other television shows, I think now firefighters are almost used as icons of a pure form of heroism.